everybody hear me okay? Thank you. Just a couple of housekeeping tips. Please silence any devices. And if you have trouble hearing at any point this evening, this room can be a little tricky. It's got great acoustics for music, and we're pretty sure it's great for voices speaking tonight. But if you have trouble, just raise your hand, and we do have assisted hearing devices that are quite helpful. My name is Ann Scott. I'm proud to be the executive director of the Nantucket Athenaeum, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this beautiful, historic Great Hall this evening. And I'm so happy to acknowledge Dan Geschke, who's here this evening. And it was the vision of Dan and Chuck Geschke that made this series possible with the help of a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. I'd also like to give a very special thanks to the Geschke series ticket holders and to the generous sponsors of our new exciting summer tradition weekend at the library. And to every one of you who purchased a ticket tonight, thank you. It takes this continued support to help us raise 75% of our operating budget every year. That enables us to bring you this kind of summer programming as well, but also to serve our island community all year long. I'd like to thank Tracy Flannery, who is the president of our board of trustees, for, among many other things, introducing us to Dr. Aruni Bhatnagar, PhD, a fellow of the American Heart Association, chief of the Division of Environmental Research at the University of Louisville, and director of the Christina Lee Brown Envirome Institute. Tonight, he's presenting research on how the natural environment affects human well-being and disease risk. We're so glad to have you. Please help me welcome Dr. Bhatnagar.
I hope everybody can hear me. Okay, great, thank you. And thank you, Tracy, for the invitation, and thank you, Anne, for the introduction. I'm so glad to be here in such an august and historic place, and it's really humbling to be able to be here tonight and be able to talk to you. What I thought I'll do tonight is to talk something about the work that we have been doing and the passions that we have in understanding and learning from nature and how we can all improve our health by better interaction with nature. So let me first start with thinking about what is health. And I think that the most accepted definition is from the WHO, saying that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. I can hear a little echo. Is it okay with you? Is it? Okay. So, but this is not a sufficient definition because it only talks about health as a sort of single-dimensional property, which it is not, as you know, and you can see from the circle that we put on your chairs about the health is a very multi-dimensional possession, and this entity comes not only from the well-being of your physical self, but also with your interaction with society and your social relationships. So it is an earned resource with which we can accomplish things that we want to do with a life. So how do we begin to think about health in a unique and new way? We know that one specific characteristics that determines our health is the human genome. Is our genes determine to what extent and to how long we would live, all the diseases that we will be susceptible to, and the things that we would do would affect our well-being. But that's only part of the picture, because the human genome is, of course, very complex, but more importantly, it is immutable, at least for now. We cannot change our genes, and therefore, what is really changeable, what we have some control over, is something that we call analogous to the genome is the envirome. And the envirome is the set of environmental conditions that affect our fitness and our health, and it is specific to an individual. We all share our genes with multiple plants and animals, just like we share our environment with everybody. But then everybody has their own individual personal genome. And the same way, everybody has their own personal envirome, this little world that we live in. And that is a key determinant of our health and well-being. So how do we study the human environment? You know, human beings are very complex and we exist in large social networks, and these networks have been created by our unique history and our culture. And therefore, it has been very difficult, especially as people looking at health as a clinical entity or even health as a social resource, to be able to understand the exact and complicated influence of the environment on health. But we submit that the actual environment, this environment that we live in, has a specific structure. And that if we can understand that structure, we might be able to have a new vision of health, a new understanding of the processes that help and foster a health and well-being. So what this structure may be, it could be an environment that is actually composed of multiple layers of complexity. There is, of course, the natural environment, which is the primordial environment on this earth that we live in. And then concatenated within that, or sort of nested within that, is a social environment. It's the environment that we create from nature. And then within that social environment, there's also a personal environment. And this personal environment is actually something that we create on our own. And there's a saying that I like, which says that, you know, that heaven is some sort of a wedding between a circumstance and your choices, right? And so what choices you make in a circumstances, if they concur, then you are in harmony and you have health and well-being, but that's usually very difficult. So what I want to talk to you about today is the natural environment. And as you know, the natural environment is very complex. It's got multiple constituents. You know, there is the geography of our natural environment, where we are, altitudes, latitudes. It also has to do with our things that are in this environment, pollutants and other animals, microbes. All of these have very significant and profound influence on our health and well-being. So, for example, we have the cycles of night and day. And every living individual or entity on this planet is entrained to this cycle of night and day. And there is very little we can do to deviate from it. Even if you deviate by a few hours, there is a heavy penalty to pay. And in all of us, there are these clocks that keep time and are constantly being synchronized with the day and night cycle. And we know that about 13 to 15% of our genes vary every day. They go up in the day or go down in the day, and they come up in the night, and they have a circadian rhythm. And so it is our sort of connection with with nature that is critical for us to maintain in order for us to have good health. We cannot violate this connection. For instance, we all know that sleep is a foundational aspect of a biology that we really need, we cannot do without sleep. And that even when we have a little bit more, like an hour more sleep or hour less sleep, there are profound effects. And as several studies have shown that if you have a long duration of sleep or a short duration, your risk spikes. So if you are sleeping less than 6 hours, your death rate risk increases by 12%. If you're sleeping more than 8 hours, then your risk is increased by 30%. So we know that sleep is absolutely critical for our health. And not only just sleep, but sleep at the right time. And then we know that if there is even a slight disturbance of sleep, then we could have changes in blood pressure, and then that causes particular damage to the blood vessels and increases your risk for heart disease. We know that short sleep duration is associated with higher prevalence of hypertension, and this is likely also to precipitate in a cardiovascular event. So sleep is critical for our well-being, and it is important that our sleep is synchronized with the cycle of night and day. Another aspect with which we interact with the environment, of course, is the food. And we know that there are there is an important relationship between food and our health. And we know that there are certain types of which we call diets or certain types of foods choices that we make would affect our not only our health and well-being, but also our longevity and our fitness. So there is a lot of work and interest now to think of looking at food in different ways. Can we restrict our diet? Can we only eat at a certain time of the day? Would that make a difference? Would we have a food that is just most a keto diet that's got a lot of meat and fat? Or we can have a diet that just have very low in protein. So some of the studies are interesting and provocative, and we know that suppose you're on ketogenic diet, which is very low in carbohydrates, less than 30 or 50 grams of carbohydrate per day. You can most of the calories come from fat, and for many years it's been known to treat epilepsy, and some studies with rats at least show that keto diet works, but we don't know how long term this diet affects health. Then there is the fasting mimicking diet, and you can have some low levels of consumption of food, and maybe that's going to prolong life. Again, there's good but somewhat conflicting data from primates that restricted diet could actually increase lifespan. And there are many people who sort of practice that, thinking that we can extend lifespan by eating less. But it's not clear how effective it is, and particularly it takes out all the energy and the vitality that you have by going in this severely calorie restricted diet. Then there is a time restricted feeding, which goes back to the idea that there is an inextricable link between us and our environment, and that if you only eat at a particular time, that it might be very helpful. The time restricted diet could be considered as a variant of intermittent fasting. So you only eat within like 8 hours in a day, and so that might be helpful. But again, the data are not very clear because it's very difficult to do such studies. And some studies may actually suggest that may mess up your glucose metabolism if you're only eating at one particular time. Because if you eat a whole lot of food at a time, it's just going to spike your glucose, and the rest of the day, the glucose dips down. So you need to have some constant food eating during the course of the day. So not only are we really sort of wedded to the cycles of night and day, we are also entrained to the rhythms of the season. And we know that there are some times of the year where it's easier to maintain cholesterol levels, easier to maintain your risk burden. And we all know that there is lower rates of mortality in winter. And this study actually is from Los Angeles, where there's been no winter to speak of. But still, you can see that during the summer months, there is a large dip in mortality, and the mortality increases in summer. It's not the temperature, it's not humidity, it's something that we don't yet understand. And one idea is that maybe something to do with sunlight, because few people realize that like plants, we depend upon the sun to make biologically active material. And in our case, it is vitamin D, that unless we are in the sun, we have enough vitamin D, we are not going to be able to thrive. I mean, even in the United States, here in Boston, till the 1890s, the levels of rickets in children was about 50 to 60%. And until vitamin D was added as a supplement, that there was a sort of constant threat of bone malformation and rickets because of lack of vitamin D. But in addition to just making vitamin D, sunlight can also do a number of things. Of course, it affects your mood very profoundly. It can also lower your blood pressure. It can also entrain your master clock, which is in your brain. So just like plants, we have a daily and undeniable link with sunlight, and that we should be able to determine what the right level of exposure is, and it varies from people to people. I think everybody knows well that people with lighter skin and need more sun exposure, less sun exposure than people with darker skin who need much more sun exposure. So if you're in the United States, up in upper latitudes, there's very little sun exposure. In Boston, again, the sunlight UV exposure from, say, October to March is essentially zero. So you would need to have enough sunlight stored during the summer to be able to last you through the winter, because we can store vitamin D. It's a fat soluble vitamin. In addition to just the sunlight in the environment, our wellness also depends upon the latitude. And there are studies showing that any time you go north from the equator or even south from the equator, the blood pressure increases as a gradient, and the prevalence of hypertension increases. Again, we don't know the reason is, but there is some sort of relationship between geography and our well-being. Another example is the altitude, that if you go to higher places which are higher in altitude, you have less disease risk. And people who live in high altitude spaces have lower risk of coronary heart disease, and they adapted to be there. One example comes from Switzerland, and what the study shows, don't worry about the numbers, but what the study shows that if you are born in a high altitude, then you have a lower risk of dying, and that even if you move to a lower latitude in your life, the advantage continues. And so people who are born at higher altitudes somehow seem to be thriving more and live more healthy lives. But in addition to just being able to vet it to nature, we have failed to realize these critical links about how important our natural surroundings are to us. And instead, what we have done is created this artificial world that has filled our natural world with pollutants. And we are living in areas which have high levels of air pollution. And we know that air pollution has been the cause of a number of premature deaths in the world, approximately 7 million premature deaths per year. It rivals the risk of smoking around the planet. And so we really need to commit ourselves to reducing the level of air pollution, which has become the #1 preventable cause of death because of the adverse effects of the exposure. But it's not just then living next to industrial plants and so on. Every day, our exposure to things like road and traffic has a profound effect on our health. And we have done several studies to show that people who live within 50 to 100 meters of a major roadway are more likely to have chronic diseases and more risk than people who live far away from the roadways. And the really remarkable part about the story is that most of the underprivileged and perhaps most of the sort of colored communities in this country, which were redlined, have roadways going through them because the roadways were deliberately sort of diverted through these low-income societies. This not only create air pollution, but they actually split the communities by sort of literally transecting their heart with these hardcore all the roads and the freeways. It is very difficult to overcome this legacy of years and years of discrimination, but I think we need to understand the gravity of the exposure and the risk and be able to mitigate that. So how do we mitigate the effects of the urban environments that we live in and the adverse effects of the built environment that we inhabit? And one of the ideas was that maybe it has to do with green spaces, that being around green spaces would be helpful. And there is a lot of data showing that those who live in green spaces actually have lower rates of cardiovascular disease. We encounter green spaces in a number of different scenarios, into the natural environment, in the social environment, and in our personal environments. So natural environments, of course, the forests and the parks there, but even in cities, we have urban green spaces and personal environments. There's something about greenness and living things that we have an innate affinity for. This is called the biophilia hypothesis. We go back to our homes and we put plants there. We spend so much time creating for little green things, little furry things. Why? Because we have this evolutionary tendency to be around living things, and we just cannot live without that. So in all our environmental exposures, we are really keen on greenness and what greenness could do for us as our companions. But what is the scientific evidence? So there is a study from the UK showing that the rate of cardiovascular death was about half as much in areas where people were living in greener environments. So certainly that helps understand maybe there is a relationship between greenness and health. But the most sort of striking example, which actually got us into this path, was this study, which was studying the loss of ash trees in the United States. About a few years ago, maybe a decade ago, there was ash borer infestation, which killed off trees in the northern United States, maybe over 10 to 50 million trees, and it moved from the north to the south. And so as the trees started dying, we saw an increase in the mortality of cardiovascular mortality in those communities. So the idea is that in communities in which trees die, people die as well. So we have this connection with greenness, and that bond keeps us healthy. Another example of this is there's a study by a friend of mine who showed survival of people after stroke. So you can see the upper line, which says high greenness. So people who live in areas of high greenness survive stroke better than people who live in areas that are less green. So this was a stroke, but we thought we should also look at other chronic diseases, particularly cancer diagnosis. And this is a study we did last year of using data from about 5 million cancer survivors. There are about 2 million deaths over, I think it was 10 or 12 years. And what we saw that areas which had higher levels of greenness show much better survival. And that was much true for higher survival cancer like breast cancer or stomach cancer, but it was very difficult in the low survival cancer like lung cancer and pancreatic cancer. So the idea is that people after cancer diagnosis, if they live among more green spaces, are their residential proximity to greenness, then they have better outcomes and have a longer lifespan. So this is a complicated issue. We do not know why these effects are. People who live in green areas tend to be richer, tend to be more aware of their health status, take better care of themselves, and so on. So there are multiple sociological reasons that we need to tease out, but at least this is a beginning. So what reasons there might be that were responsible for that? And one of the many reasons could be increased physical activity. We know that people, when they live in green spaces, tend to be more physically active. If you live in south side of Chicago or in the inner city of Louisville, there isn't much that you can do to be outside. It's not a pleasant experience, and it is issues of safety and so on. So it prohibits people from being outdoors. But in green neighborhoods with urban parks, with tree-lined streets, it's much easier to be outside and to be physically active. So maybe greenness is beneficial because of the increased propensity and encouragement for exercise. There's also an idea that greenness increases social cohesion. If you have green spaces outside, you have a lovely garden, you go and talk to your neighbors, and you're not just distress everybody. Like I know some examples, again, from Chicago. There was a heat wave there, and the people lost the power, but they couldn't go out or like open the window because in inner Chicago, all the windows are boarded because it's so unsafe. Nobody has open windows in inner Chicago. So these people had their windows boarded and they can't go out of the house. And virtually at least 150 people were just died because of excessive heat. So if the environment outside your house is not pleasant, how can that person exist in a state of health? It becomes virtually impossible because they're condemned to live in these unconducive environments. There are additional reports which show that maybe greenness is conducive to mental health. People who live in more green spaces have report that they have better mental health, low levels of anxiety and depression. There's a study from Japan shows that people who live in green spaces have lower rates of suicide. So that you live in areas in the world that you like and that you belong to and you have a sense of belonging, then you would be more resilient to disease and to anxiety. But then there's additional research showing that greenness could also increase your cognitive ability. There is something about nature that doesn't require effort when you attend to it. If you talk to people, if you're looking at other things, it always requires attention, demands energy and attention from you. But looking at nature is effortless. It doesn't require any energy, it doesn't require any attempt on your part. And so if you go to nature and spend time there, there's a restorative effect of nature that you are, when you come back, you have better cognition. And these studies have been shown in people, in children, and being around nature. Nature is also very effective in overcoming trauma like PTSD and overcoming anxiety. And so I had a study where these women who have been diagnosed with breast cancer have so much anxiety, but then they spend like a weekend in the nature with their friends. It completely refreshes them and come back more resilient and being able to deal with their condition than people who continue to live in inner cities. So that's a really sort of a mental effect of nature, but there are also physical effects. For example, being in nature can increase your immunity. Nature has all these bacteria, fungus, viruses, whatever, and mostly they are not bad. We have learned to deal with them over the million years that we have evolved with them. And there's a theory that these are our old friends, and that if we lock ourselves in a clean environments, we are divorced from our old friends, and so our body does not know what to do. It attacks itself. So most of the autoimmune diseases, most of the disease like asthma or multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis is increased by living in very clean environments. So we need exposure to nature. We know that children who are brought up on farms and around farm animals and dirt are actually more healthy, and they have lower rates of asthma. So being in nature exposes us to a variety of different antigens, and that increases our immune resilience by educating our immune system on how to deal with the world outside our bodies. And that we are losing sort of systematically by shutting ourselves in, using antiseptic soaps and being scared of infections. And I know COVID didn't make things any easier, but there are lots of other viruses and bacteria which are not as harmful. But it's not just the physical interaction with nature, even looking at nature. So this was a really very interesting study in which what they showed that people after gallbladder removal, when they were put in a hospital room and they were randomized, put in a room with looking out at bricks or a room that looked out into a garden, then people who were in a room with looked out in the garden recovered 2 days earlier. They required less pain medication than people who were looking at a brick wall. So just looking at nature has a calming effect on us and and helps us deal with trauma and pain. So we do not know what this relationship would be. Maybe there are other ways in nature could be helpful. So what we wanted to do is to look at what could trees be doing in addition to these mental effects. Maybe they are cleaning the air, they're making the living areas healthier. So we went around Louisville and we sort of recruited people from all over the city, and we tried to look at the levels of the metabolites in the urine of these pollutants we're exposed to. So you don't need to worry about the different names and numbers here. The only thing is that a lot of them you can see on the left side of the line showing that people who live in more green spaces have lower exposure to these pollutants. So then the question was, okay, fine, how far away the green space needs to be? Is it next door greenery that makes a difference, or street trees that make a difference? So this is a sort of distance dependent effect. And so it is peaking or maximal effect is between 100 to 200 meters. So when you live in green spaces that between 100 and 200 meters of your residence, that has the maximal effect. It disappears when over a kilometer, and it's not so pronounced as like right next to your bedroom window. But within the area that you live, it is critical to have green spaces. So the overall conclusion of the study we had was maybe we have in places that are green, have lower levels of exposure to these chemicals, we call them VOCs. And then in areas that are low greenness, there is greater exposure to pollutants. There's also changes in your arterial stiffness, and you don't have to worry about the details, but it shows that your arteries are more pliable, more younger if you live in green spaces, and more resilient to exposure to environmental pollutants. Greenness can also decrease stress, and people have been talking about this for a long time, that being in green spaces can decrease the levels of stress. So we measured the levels of stress hormones in the urine. I think it was like about 800 people or whatever. So you can see one of the hormones is called epinephrine, which is a fight and flight hormone, and it causes stress and increases your blood pressure and heart rate. Those levels are much lower in people who live in green spaces. So people are much more, much less anxious and much more relaxed when around greenery. So we thought that this is all an association. Like I said, you don't know. People who live in green spaces can be better off for a variety of different reasons, which may have nothing to do with greenness. So what we thought was, okay, what we do is we take a social structure as it is, and then increase greenness in it, and then see what will happen. So one of the first experiments we did with Christie's inspiration, there was what's called the Green for Good. And this was in a school in Louisville. And the school, as you can see, was next to a major freeway. And between the school and the freeway, there were no trees. So all the traffic from this thoroughfare was spewing onto the children playing outside the school. So we went there and we went to the Catholic priest who was the headmaster and said, we want to do the study in your school and see if you plant trees in front of your compound and then see what difference it make to the kids. And we were quite scared because they're Catholics and we didn't know how they would receive us. But they were very receptive. And we went there, we recruited over 60 children and we got their blood and their urine and, stuck them with the needle and they did fine. Only one fainted, the others were fine. And then after that, when we put the trees and we went back again, all of them came back and said, oh no, we're going to give blood again. We want to see what happens. So anyway, so we put a little barrier like that between the road and the school, and we found that these children had lower levels of exposure because of the trees that were there, and that there were signs that they had better immune responses. So that encouraged us, telling us that if we can create this barrier of trees and make a difference, then maybe that will change the levels of air pollution and improve the structure of a community for the better. So we launched this project about 5 years ago. It is called the Green Heart Project, and this is a very sort of strange and unique project. It is an unusual partnership with a number of different entities, including the Nature Conservancy, the National Institutes of Health, the U.S. Forest Services, our university, WashU, Cornell, and of course the city of Louisville and other places, and HiFi, who designed all these things from Oakland, California. We got all these people together and said, there's all this evidence linking greenness with health, but that's all associative. We want to do something, what we call like a clinical trial. So you take one area and an adjacent area and then only put trees in one area and not the other area, and then see what happens to the health of the people living in the community. And certainly you can't do that by planting small trees. It will take us 30 to 50 years to do the experiment. So we had to plant some very large trees. So I'll tell you that story. So our hypothesis was that if you're exposed to greenness in the neighborhood, it will decrease the risk of your heart disease. And this is because the levels of pollution in the area would go down. So what did we do? Well, we went to a neighborhood. This is a low-income neighborhood. The average income is about $15,000, $20,000. There are about 25,000 people in this neighborhood, and it's unique in the sense it's got both Black and white residents, and so they live next door, which is unusual. And then this has low levels of tree cover. So we went and we adopted this neighborhood in South Louisville, and then we rented a plane. We flew over the neighborhood and looked at all the trees that were in the neighborhood, so we can see this particular program can tell us if the trees are stressed. So you can see these yellow trees, they are the stressed trees, and the red ones are really stressed trees. So we can go to some of these are ash trees, so we had to treat them to make them more resilient. And then we can identify all the species and location of all these trees. And then we do a LiDAR scan, so we actually can recreate the entire neighborhood with every leaf or blade of grass in the neighborhood into our LiDAR scans. And this is what it looks like about the leaf area index, at how dense the greenery is in different places, and what's the height of the canopy in different places. And so we would be able to tell areas where there is greenness or not, and we can then be able to look at the levels of greenness in different places within the neighborhood. Now, once we did this initial survey, we did a cardiovascular exam, and we recruited over 700 people, and we do an 1.5-hour exam where we look at their physical demographic data. We look at their blood pressure, heart rate, we look at the ECGs and so on. So we do a very detailed workup of the cardiovascular function. And then we said, once we've done that, then we could go to the next step to plant trees. But unfortunately, COVID hit, so we had to, scale back our efforts for a couple of years. But as soon as COVID ended, we sort of continued doing that. So we did a psychosocial evaluation. We have done that every year. We do that, and it's year 4, and we look at anxiety, depression, sense of well-being, and purpose of living, it's a very surprising finding, but people who have a really strong purpose of living, purpose to live, are most resilient against disease for whatever reason, because they have something to live for, then therefore they're less susceptible to chronic disease. So we have graded people according to the strength of their purpose in life. So after this mental evaluation, we also did evaluation of the local air pollution. We put in like at 60 sites around the neighborhood. We have these monitors on the utility poles and be able to get sort of data that would tell us the levels of air pollution in the neighborhood. Then we did some mobile monitoring. And this is actually just a graduate student, and she got a golf cart and drove around the neighborhood. She covered over 3,800 miles during the course of her PhD. After that, we had to award her the thesis. There was no backing out, but she did the outstanding work looking at where the levels of air pollution is. And you can see the red dots those are the levels where pollution is high. And the reason for doing this is that when we were going to go plant trees, we preferentially would plant trees where the levels of pollution were high, so that we can target greening and not do greening as an uneducated and uninformed activity, but something that we have carefully selected to be able to prevent the levels of air pollution. Then we measured, or another set of studies looked at where the pollution was. And interestingly, the highest levels of pollution we found was around fast food restaurants. So when people go to fast food restaurants, the cars would idle, and then the levels of air pollution would increase. So we identify hotspots of air pollution and targeted our planting to those areas. And then we know we cannot plant small trees, but it's going to take 30 years for them to grow. So we had to plant some very large trees. And these trees are not like your 2-foot, 3-foot twigs. They are actually 30, 40-foot mature trees. And our plan was to plant about 8,000 to 10,000 of these trees. And as you can think, it's a very enormously costly activity. That's why we needed the support from the Nature Conservancy. They did a global fundraising campaign for our program. And the whole project, I think, would end up costing more than $15 million to date, and we still want to continue. It's not over yet. So then we got these large trees from all over the area, including places like Portland and Ohio and Tennessee. And then these were actually put in a central spot and then taken to plant at the areas where the pollutants were high. We designed buffers, and I'll show you what we were doing there. And we planted them also in people's homes. We went to door and said, would you like a tree? And some people said, go away. I don't want to see your face again. Some people were said, oh, this is wonderful. Nobody's ever come to us giving us trees. And some people said, oh, so what's the catch? Like, would you be stuck with the bill? And then other people said, oh, if the tree falls, who's going to take care of that? So all these things, we said, we will pay for all this. We will even water your trees for the next 5 years. And we continue to maintain that. So we put trees in people's homes. We also went to put trees in the side of the roadways, and the conditions were like this, were pretty bad. So we had to remediate the soil, because to grow good trees, you need good soil. And we brought in actual the soil to be able to replenish all the soil that was there. And then we brought in these large trees to be put on the sides of the road to prevent the air pollution from going into the community. So we planted these trees around the sound wall. And like you see here, they're very, very large trees, and it requires a lot of time and effort. Every tree had to be spaded in. And when we were done, we have this sort of buffer next to the roadway, so that we would be able to shield the people in the community from exposure to air pollution. We have different configurations we're trying. Some places we left empty so we can compare control and treated areas. So that would be able to tell what the level of reduction in air pollution was. And some of our computer modeling tells us then when you have trees planted in a certain design, a manner where there's a small trees, bigger trees, then you can sort of get the pollution out from the area easily. But if you have haphazard planting, you make things worse. So if you go on a street and there is a lot of busy traffic, and then you have these lollipop trees on both sides of the street, that's quite common in this country. When the tailpipe emissions come out from the car, they accumulate in the understory of these lollipop trees and make things worse. So at the nose level, the amount of air pollution actually increases with trees. So we don't want to do that. We want to develop and to understand the right configuration of the planting. So what we learn that how to plant trees in urban locations, in how does the neighborhood, how the health is affected by these trees. We are still in the process of trying to figure out the results. we have not published. We found some very exciting results showing that people who live in the areas of where we put the trees have lower levels of inflammation and better vascular function than people in the control area where we did not put the trees. So we are still learning, and we want to continue this project as long as we can get the NIH to support us for maybe another 30, 40, 50 years. Hopefully, like our graduate students and future leaders will continue this work which we have started. But we also want to talk a little bit about the small project we're doing. It's called the Traeger Microforest Project. So this greenery and the Green Heart Project was against the whole community. And that's usually difficult. I mean, I give talks and people come to me from everywhere. The mayor of Sydney and Milan and Bristol and Melbourne and Sao Paulo, they say, oh, we want to do the Green Heart Project in our city. But it's very difficult, like millions and millions of dollars to put these large trees, and they don't have the resources for that. And even if you get the money, they cannot have the technical scientific background to be able to do and evaluate the effect of trees. So we thought we'll do a small case in which we go to downtown, and this is downtown Louisville, and you can see this park on the right there. It's a little park, and we said, what if we take this park and we create a forest in the park? Right? So it would be that you do really dense planting and see how that would affect the health of the people living around there and interacting with this. How would it affect the community? How would it affect the air pollution, humidity, temperature? We have one of the worst heat island effects in the country because the heat is so much. So if you put trees, little microforests in the middle of trees, what will that do? So this is the current configuration. We have like this concrete cross there in the middle of the park. It is a park that is owned by the city, and they have been given to us on a 30-year lease. So what we are trying to do is to plant trees in very dense areas. So create this little forest, and it's called the Milwaukee forest, because if you grow trees separately, they go very slowly. But you put them densely together, then they compete with each other for light and grow 3 to 4 times faster. This was a Japanese professor who figured out this method. It's been done many places in Japan and Asia, but not in the United States. So we thought we'll create this little micro forest in the middle of the town and then study its impact on the environment and on the people who live around it. And so that they can also be interacting with us. So we can have a little area where people could interact with this forest and be able to spend time there, so that we would also be able to create a sense of well-being and health in the community right in the middle of downtown where nobody wants to go. But we think that if we do this, that we might be able to create some sort of a global model, in which case we would be able to at least offer some suggestions about how cities should be greened. We are going to devote a lot of time in greening. We know that climate change is an increasingly difficult problem, and that if we are going to be able to do it right, we need to be judicious and careful and thoughtful about it, and just not be sort of driven by the zeal. Let's go plant trees. We don't know how, when, where, how many. Just so that sort of uneducated zeal needs temperance. So we will create, hopefully, healthier cities that would be greener, would be more pleasant, more healthy to live in. And so therefore, we would be able to understand that model and create that model that could be replicated worldwide. So to do this work, we have been working with the University of Louisville, but lately we're trying to build a whole new center. This is, again, downtown Louisville, next to our Traeger microforest. We want to create buildings that are healthy, breathable, livable, and just simply pleasurable to be in. So this is the potential phase of a future laboratory. This is part of downtown Louisville, and then we think that we will be able to develop new modes of living even in dense places. So I think I'm going to end here and answer any questions that you might have, but I do want to thank you again for the invitation and for your kind attention to this topic. Yes, sir.
Thanks so much for the talk. I would love to hear your opinion on the supplements that are popular in places like Silicon Valley for longevity, like metformin.
Yes, so metformin is a drug which is used quite frequently to treat diabetes. It is supposed to rev up your metabolism, and it's very helpful in preventing diabetes, and it's very widely used. There are a lot of people microdosing with metformin and have been doing that for a while. They have really good results, and we think that it could affect longevity. I mean, I personally have not taken it, but there's some evidence that it could be useful. It could even be useful for cancer, and by increasing the metabolism of cancer cells or changing the metabolism so that they're not dependent on glucose, but they depend on other sources of energy, makes them grow slowly. So there is a lot of promise, but there has not been a large randomized controlled trial to provide unequivocal data that taking metformin can prolong lifespan or even affect chronic disease risks in people who are not otherwise diabetic or have cancer. Yes, sir. Oh, that's a good question. Thank you for asking that. We did fret over that for a long time. Our major objective. What's that? Oh, the question was, are some trees better than other trees? So we did worry about that. And our purpose here was to decrease the levels of air pollution in the community. We studied a whole range of species, and there's a lot of literature. Some species are more efficient in removing pollution than others. The best are the evergreens. And so about, I would say 90+% of the trees that we planted were evergreens, as you may have seen. And these are very good because they have these sticky leaves, the pine needles on, and they actually adhere to these air particles that remove this dust particles in the air. And even them, in there we have differences. Some trees are very good. For example, some plant species, for example, the yews are better than the hollies, and then the hollies are better than the pines, and the cedars are equally good, but they actually they're not very hardy and don't go do very well in urban environments. So part of the problem, but the project is to find out which species are more efficient, because we are concurrently measuring the air levels of air pollution. We're also measuring the survivability of different species. We didn't want to create a monoculture in the whole environment, in the whole neighborhood. So there are about 35 to 45 different species that we used to populate the neighborhood. And so we are going to be able to get some answers of which species are not only better at removing air pollution, but more resilient in urban environments. Yes, ma'am. How does what travel?
We have a lot of privet on the island.
I know.
And we have trees, and I would say this is a green spot. It's a blue spot. It's a healthy spot, but I'm just wondering how privet works. Does privet
well,
it's a lot of it's buffer on many streets here.
That's right. That's right.
Increasing traffic.
So maybe that's our next study. We'll just come to Nantucket and compare the relative efficacy of pivots and trees. To your answer to your question, we don't know. We haven't compared. Yes. Yes, so the question is what other cities are thinking and how would they do this. So yes, we have been to many of these meetings. There is a Global World Alliance, there's a Global Cities Forum, and all cities, as far as I know, are trying to increase their greenness. And they are really concerned about how to do it right, and they have been struggling with that. But very few cities have actually measuring the impact. Lots of cities plant trees. I mean, I gave a lecture a month ago to the New York Park Department. New York is committed to putting 1 million trees. I think they already accomplished their goal. They put in 1 million trees. After putting the trees a year later, if 500,000 died, that's a different story. But they didn't follow up to see how long the survival was. Just put in 1 million trees, and now they're going to put another 1 million trees. And so we asked them, how do you study the impact? So the main message of our work, if any, is that it is not sufficient to do an intervention. It is absolutely critical to assess the impact, because if you do not know what you did and what are the consequences of what you did, then it is not going to be helpful to you or anybody else, and nobody in the world would know about it. So none of the cities actually document what they're doing. And it's really startling, because cities like Detroit, I know for this year and the next year, have got a budget over $40 million to plant trees in the city. But there's no attempt to evaluate. The only couple of cities I know, there was a study from, there's an ongoing study in Sydney, Australia, where they are looking at asthma rates before and after planting trees. There was actually a very dense tree planting in Portland, Oregon, and they found before they did the greening of the city and after they did the greening, there was a 15% decrease in the death rate in Oregon. So they were very excited about the data. They just published it a few months ago, showing that if you green a city, then you can decrease mortality in a city. So I think that's very encouraging. And that we are following things in Louisville as what will happen. I mean, our study is too young to measure death rates, but in course of time we would. And also we would encourage other cities to do the same. And small cities, particularly your city here, is particularly well poised to do such things because larger cities are much more difficult. And that if there were ways in which we could do this here or other similar smaller cities, that's where the most useful data would come from. Yes, sir. You do that. So that's a great question. I agree with you. Everything that we do, and maybe some of the foods that we eat are very pro-inflammatory. And there's inflammation is low-grade inflammation is leading cause of premature mortality, death, and aging. And that we have been very deliberate about what things we measure. We have a panel of about 56 cytokines that we measure in each individual. And we have all the major ones, IL-6, IL-12, TNF-alpha, IL-1. And our results to date, which have been most startling, has been about CRP, which is called a C-reactive protein, which is a measure of your infectivity, so some mild sorts of infection or ongoing inflammation. And we found that people who live around trees actually have lower levels of CRP. We also found, especially in the children in the Green for Good program, that there is an increase in what we call the NKT cells or natural killer T cells. And the natural killer T cells are really the foot soldiers of the immune system. They go out and kill all the bacteria. So we see the levels increase when people spend time around trees. And others have also reported that if you spend time in green spaces, forests, and so on, we are also doing that, and we're doing it in two different places. We've done a study already in Nantucket and Colorado, and now we're doing a study in a garden outside Quebec. And so we would take people there, we see an increase in the T cell responses and a decrease in CRP levels. So that's what we're measuring, but we have yet to characterize the entire spectrum of cytokines and how they're affected by greening. Yes. So there is, I think, incontrovertible evidence that people who sleep more, too much or too little, have higher mortality, but for entirely different reasons. If you have low levels or lower times, smaller times of sleep, 6 hours or less, then that lack of sleep causes you to have a number of other diseases and increases risk for chronic disease. If you sleep more than 8 hours more, that something is wrong. It's sleep. So extended sleep is a symptom of some underlying pathology. So if you are already not feeling well, if you don't have the energy, or you have some chronic disease, or a cancer growing inside you, or whatever, all these internal causes then cause you to sleep more, which is then associated with mortality. So low sleep causes a causal relationship with early mortality, and long sleep is a symptom of disease risk. So if you are sleepy more than 8 hours and still not being able to function, then there is something organically wrong and that needs to be examined. Yes, sir. There's a question in the back? Okay. Right. So blue zones are areas in which people have long lifespans. And one of the classic example is the island of Okinawa in Japan, where I think the average age is like about 98 or 99. And there are these, especially women, one in like five or one in seven are actually over 100. And so we do not know what the reason is. Maybe they have a really uncontaminated areas that they live in, and so they have lower exposure to air pollution. But some people think it's the diet because they eat a lot of fish and rice, and they have very strong social bonds. I mean that's a critical element as well. So these are the main determinants of health. We are trying to struggle with the definition of health and aging. We thought that we would understand what aging is, but we do not know. And I joke with my students that if I grow a beard and wear a toga and go to the NIH and say, tell me what is age, what is health, nobody would know what the health is, right? And they have all institute with the $30 billion budget on working on health without understanding what health is. So we have not been able to come to a definition. We are not any brighter than the NIH or the WHO, but we think that there are ways in which we can improve health, and there we have found three main pillars of health, which we think are sleep, good nutrition, and physical activity. And if you have at least these things, at least you will have good physical health. Maybe you need other things for other forms of health, but at least for physical health, you need these three pillars. And so aging, we would define as something that we would help us maintain a health span for a long time. So it should be measured in the ability to remain healthy and to be able to accomplish the task that you want to accomplish. So if you're an old person and you don't want to really run a marathon or win the Olympics, but whatever your ambitions are, if you're able to meet those ambitions and obligations, you're a healthy person. And if you cannot, then you're not healthy. So aging is sort of a time-dependent loss of ability that we can modify by creating healthy individuals. The funny part is people think that, oh, we, in old age, if we take care of ourselves, it'll be fine. No, but the healthy young people make healthy old people. So you have to be healthy from the very beginning and be able to perform functions that you think as a 10-year-old, as a 30-year-old, as a 50-year-old, and then only then you would be a healthy 80-year-old. So we measure health as measure age as a health span and not a chronological number. Yes. It's never too late to start. So we have seen this. We've seen this with exercise. We've seen this with better food. We've seen this people living in healthier environments. So there is a lot of evidence that even late interventions are very effective. If you start eating well, even to your 70s and 80s, and maybe then you can decrease the risk of chronic disease. You have, I would think, and this is just my hunch, old people or people who are older in age require much more social bonds than younger people would do. Because as you get older, your social networks become increasingly important to you. And to some old individuals, a source of great health and resilience. So the requirements may change from a young person to an old person, whether it's nutrition requirement, exercise requirement, social requirements, they all would vary. They vary with age, but at any age, if you increase your physical activity, you prioritize sleep, and you sort of make attempts to have good food, then that will undoubtedly be useful. It's never too late to do that.
I think that might be a great place to close. And I just have a few thank yous to make. If you could just stand another moment. Thank you so much for this informative presentation, Dr. Bhatnagar. I have, yeah, thank you.
Right there.
This is a book on the history of the Nantucket Athenaeum. I think what you'll really enjoy. It's a beautiful book put together by the Preservation Trust.
All right, thank you.
And also, this is the last Geschke lecture for this particular season this year. And I I want to take a moment to thank some staff because they've worked awfully hard. Sammy and Sean have just been intrepid, really. And finally, I think it's appropriate, since it is the last lecture this year, to thank Nan Geschke with a special gift. A local artisan of fine jewelry, Katie Grover, has crafted some beautiful 24 karat earrings that are a model of the Athenaeum, and just in appreciation, Nan, for this series and for all of your support, not just of the Athenaeum, but of this community in general, and so many communities. We just appreciate everything that you do, and this is for you. And finally, the Institute, thank you so much for providing, there's a beautiful reception waiting for all of you downstairs if you have time to stop in and have a glass of wine and a nibble. And that's their thanks to you. And thank you all for coming.